There's a wonderful story in my book, Mind to Matter, about this astrophysicist who was a real non-believer in meditation and acupressure and energy and all these things. But he decided to go on an 8-week journey to learn mindfulness. And researchers looked at him, gave him a big battery of tests before the 8 weeks and after the 8 weeks. And so before he began his journey, they got him into an MRI lab, and they measured the volume of every single part of his brain, down to the last cluster of neurons. They knew exactly how much neural tissue he had in each part of his brain, because they knew that over 8 weeks, neural growth would occur, neurogenesis would occur as he used new neural pathways. So after 2 weeks, his behavior began to change. He had less road rage, he had less fits of anger against his family, against his team. Then after 8 weeks, these researchers got him back into the lab. And in chapter 2, I have the whole story of how this guy went back into the lab after 8 weeks, only 8 weeks, 2 months, and they measured his brain again. They found that parts of his brain had grown by 2, 4, 5% in just 8 weeks. But one part of his brain grew a lot, and that's a part called the dentate gyrus, which is part of the emotional brain, and the dentate gyrus governs the regulation of emotion across multiple brain regions. This is what keeps you calm when you're stuck in traffic, when you're in line, when you have to wait for a promotion, when your spouse is doing something that annoys you, when your kid is getting on your nerves. If you have strong emotional regulation abilities, then you can calm yourself in all those circumstances. And the researchers found that in just 8 weeks, his dentate gyrus, as neural plasticity kicked in, his dentate gyrus grew by 22.8% in just 2 months. That is how startlingly quickly parts of the brain remodel themselves as we train ourselves in effective meditation and mindfulness techniques. So it's really important. There are techniques, and they're not just changing our transient temporary states. They're literally changing our traits. That will now be a much calmer man, a much more considerate man, a much more compassionate man, because he has a more compassionate brain. He has the hardware in his brain to be resilient in the face of annoyance. So it's not just changing. When we become more enlightened, when we shift ourselves, it's not just a good feeling that's temporary. It literally becomes, over time, the hardware of your brain. So it's amazing what we can do to shift our bodies and our brains with these wonderful kinds of new techniques.
Right, and then if I have this correctly, the man that you're just talking about would then change his DNA, and therefore any children that he would have would now inherit the new traits. Is that accurate?
Right, yes. They'll no longer be impatient. They'll no longer be having that hair trigger anger response. They'll have better emotional regulation. He'll pass these things along to his offspring epigenetically.
Okay, and then taking this back to ancestral healing, the methods that you're talking about then, and including tapping, let's talk about that as well. But these methods can actually help to clear our ancestors' DNA patterns in our current bodies. Is that correct?
In our current bodies, in our current behavior, and sometimes if you are doing all of this well, we've literally found that the epigenetic tags can pop off the genome. So if you can just picture, basically our DNA is made up of 4 kinds of molecules. They look, if you untangle a strand of DNA, it looks like a ladder with repeating pairs of these 4 bases. And then, of course, that's coiled into a double helix shape of the DNA. But if you uncoil that double helix, it looks like a ladder. And then these epigenetic tags are little molecules that adhere to parts of the genome that are either facilitating its expression, making it more expressed, or they are silencing a gene and making more suppressed. And those epigenetic tags, if you heal, can literally pop off. We've done one study which we did EFT tapping with veterans of PTSD. And again, we found a lot of genes had those epigenetic tags on them that had to do with stress. And so these men, most men for the most part, these men got really stressed really fast. And so PTSD is a really difficult condition to have, because if you get traumatized, you tend to get more and more traumatized over time. Your reaction times become faster and stronger. The amygdala, which is basically the main alarm in the brain, actually grows, gets bigger because you're using it more. And the parts of the brain that have to do with memory and learning and emotional regulation shrink because you aren't using them. So over time, PTSD gets worse and worse and worse. And we found that in these people with PTSD, as they received EFT treatment, that over the course of 10 sessions, those epigenetic markers literally were popping off their genes and they were going back to normal. So absolutely, you can shift that. And then you're no longer passing that irritability and that anger and that hair trigger temper on to the next generation. You then have emotional regulation, emotional control. You then do not treat your children the way your parents treated you, and you're breaking that cycle. I so strongly urge people who are having children or thinking of having children to use these techniques, because you seriously do not want to be passing along all of the phobias and the fears and the beliefs and the limitations of your ancestors to your offspring. You can say, this is not going to pass my generation. We think about trauma as being severe abuse or neglect, and it isn't. In a series of studies, I talk about these in my books, called the still face experiments. Harvard researchers had mothers sit facing their babies who were like 6 months old, and the babies were in high chairs, and the mothers were told to keep a poker face, just withdraw all emotional expression from our faces, because you and I, all adults, all normal adults, we're communicating with our faces all the time, with babies, with each other, even below the level of words. And so even that still face with the mother not giving the baby visual cues, verbal cues or visual cues for its behavior, those babies became traumatized after a few moments. At first, they would try and attract mother's attention. They would make little sounds. They would make gestures they knew could engage the mother. If the mother kept a still face, eventually the babies began to thrash around, began to cry. They actually lost control of their nervous systems, and they were unable to even sit up straight. They lost control of the nervous function. Literally, babies imprint their nervous system functioning through their parents, their fathers and their mothers. And so even not getting feedback, like we're giving each other through our faces, through our vocal tone all the time, those can be perceived by kids as traumatic. So it is powerful what's going on in these interpersonal relationships. And when we don't get what we need as children, it can leave lasting lifetime deficits.
Wow, that's absolutely fascinating. Let's get back, though, to tapping, though. I remember when I first heard about tapping, 10, 15 years ago, I thought it was the craziest thing I'd ever heard. The person who told me about it, I was like, get out of here. But since I've been reading your books and talking with you over the years, I've learned this is some powerful stuff. So for those of the people who are watching this who might not even know what tapping is, can you maybe give a little taste of what it is, how it works, and just a little flavor of it?
Tapping is super simple, and there are now over 100 clinical trials of tapping showing it's effective for anxiety, depression, PTSD, phobias, many kinds of physical problems like pain, like fibromyalgia. And what tapping is, very simply, tapping is using the principles of acupuncture. So what you're doing is you're using the acupuncture points, acupuncture meridians, but you are not using needles, you are applying pressure, gentle pressure, by tapping on those acupuncture meridians just like this. So it's just tapping on these 13 points on the body in a certain order, and while you remember bad things about your life. So you remember when you were bullied or hurt or ignored or insulted or whatever it might have been. You remember those things, but while you're doing that, you tap. And what that does is it discharges all of the energy held in those acupuncture meridians, and your energy starts to flow again. We've now done some studies using EEGs and MRIs with people who are getting tapped on, and they have massive shifts in their levels of the brain waves that are characteristic of trauma. They also have massive drops in cortisol. In one study I published in a peer-reviewed journal recently, we had people at a 5-day retreat at Esalen Institute, because I do a lot of live workshops, Esalen and Omega, all these live workshops at places where they actually test people's brainwaves, test their cortisol, test all kinds of other physical functionings that they have. And we found that over the course of 1 week of tapping, their baseline cortisol dropped by 37%. I mean, that's a massive drop in your baseline level of triggering. And then when those kinds of stress-related hormones drop, usually your beneficial hormones rise. We measure their immune function and their level of immunoglobulins. These are your basic, most important defense against colds, flu, environmental toxins, pollen, all kinds of stuff that comes into your body. Your immunoglobulins are found throughout your mucous membranes of your body, and they're what neutralizes all of those environmental threats. People's levels over that same week, as they tapped at EFT, their cortisol fell by 37%, their immunoglobulins rose by 113%. So a massive rise in immune function. So EFT, as you reduce your stress, as you use acupressure, as you balance the body's energies, all of your stress hormones drop, but all of your immune hormones and all those beneficial things in your body jump up dramatically. So EFT is simply using tapping to regulate your energy system, regulate your emotions, and feel much better about things that bother you.